So I'm going to call this no filter. There we are. So this will be another version of our layout with no filter, and I'm just going to go into element and turn filtering off, and I am then going to render it again, and we will jump back into Nuke and see what we get. Okay, so back in Nuke I've brought in the new render and I've colored the nodes. So I've made the original one green, the original utility layer green, and the new utility layer red, and I've done the old trick of adding a switch. So let's view the switch. Now you can see what's happening. So one thing we see is around the edges, and another thing is around the transparency. So when we don't have filtering, our edges are sort of puffed out almost like an unpre-multiplied image. So you can see that here on this lamppost. So that's on the opaque objects, that's the only difference, this filtering. Now let's actually look at what that does in the defocus itself. So I'm just going to move away from where the transparent objects are, just to kind of emphasize what happens with the defocus effect. So there we are. So that is without unfiltered, and that's without filtered. So you can sort of see how the fringing effect is somewhat different. So it actually is more pleasing without the filtering, which may be surprising to some of you, but it is in some ways better. You don't really want to alias depth information because it doesn't make any sense. Now with the transparent, with the refractive objects, we get even weirder stuff going on. So if we look at the actual depth pass without filtering, it's ignoring the fact this is refractive and just kind of going, that's in front of that, that's behind, and that's fine, it doesn't care. Whereas here it's trying to calculate the way the refractions work, and this is depth, but this is, we're seeing something which is at that distance. So it's trying to be more accurate. When we look at it, it just starts to break at this extreme level of depth of field. Nevertheless, it probably is more correct. So, you know, and it is a limitation of this kind of depth of field effect. It's not really built for huge macro effects. If you're going to start doing really big macro effects, you'll probably want to break your image out into layers so that you can composite them. You can apply the depth field separately to each layer and composite them one on top of the other using some kind of over operation, because you can sort of see that where it gets ambiguous, it starts to struggle in placing them in space. Okay, so I've created a possible solution for the conundrum of the refracted objects. Now what I've done is actually removed my refractions from the beauty pass, so I haven't applied them, and I've got all the way down to here. At this point I have used my unfiltered Z depth, so this one. So these are all being applied in their object space, depending on how far the object is from the camera, ignoring the fact that it's refractive and you are seeing things through it. And then I'm applying the Z defocus there. And again, I will show you this with more extreme values in a minute. And here I've got my raw refractions and my refraction filter. So my raw refractions are also having Z defocus applied, but using the filtered Z depth, which means that the refracted objects, this mug and this pistol, which are seen refracting through the glass, are in fact in focus according to the Z depth we have decided. So when I multiply those, I obviously don't get the bleeding. So there, obviously the defocus causes it to bleed. Because we're using raw refractions and we've got a refraction filter, I can kill that bleed when I multiply it. And then I'm plussing that back on top of the rendered comp. Now even if I take this up to some extreme values, let me just bring up my properties bin, bring out the Z defocus. So even if I take this up to something ridiculous, it still doesn't actually break. So there you are. So it's a little bit more pleasing than just applying it in a crude way. So you can do some compositing tricks to make Z depth work within the composite. If you can afford to, it often is better to do it within Camera, but obviously if you're animating the depth of field at all, then you really want to be doing it in comp, because animating depth of field and rack focuses within 3D is not fun. And that's the end of that. Thank you. So next we're going to look at ambient occlusion.